if you are following the RotoViz principles, you're going to be out drafting the room in all of your drafts. In some of those drafts, you'll be out drafting them to the extent that simply having taken the elite QB was the thing that was kind of the final cherry on top, where it really distances you both from your group and puts you in that mix to win the million.
Building the perfect zero RB roster in redraft. That is what we are talking about today on the RotoViz Overtime podcast. We're going to talk through some of the expanded principles that we talked about on the show earlier this week, where we looked at some of the potential misconceptions. But we have a listener team submitted from the FFPC Big Gorrilla Tournament, drafted from the 101. We're going to dive into that in just a little moment and talk about, I guess, how it looks when it's put into place in a draft and what maybe we would recommend, what we would change, what way it could play out. We have been sent the draft board, so we'll be working our way through that. And it can be very difficult, I will highlight, to, drafting at the 101 or the 112. Those turn picks can be very tricky when you're trying to balance out the ADP, the rankings, all that sort of stuff, to try and draft the perfect lineup. So we'll see here what happens with this roster that was submitted by Brad. But again, I would also urge the listeners to go and check that show that we did discuss earlier this week. I also talked with Denny Carter this week. We had some fun conversations on the RotoViz Fantasy Football show. They should be available by the time you're listening to this. The first one certainly will be, if the second one is not already posted, but subscribe over there as well. This one, Shawn, Zero RB Team Review is the email title as they look for our feedback. But I thought, again, the feedback that we can give can expand to the entire community here at RotoViz OT, because it's I love when we get them that kind of give us a broad overview for a topic. So he does highlight that he hopes I was able to grab a ticket to the NFL game that's happening in Dublin this year. Did get one of those. It was a hard ticket to get, Shawn. That game sold out, I think, in like 12 hours. And Ticketmaster was having some issues, so that may have it may have sold out quicker. But yeah, it should be a pretty crazy experience when it gets to that. It's the last Sunday in September. I'm sure there'll be some fun events happening over there. But he mentioned the FFPC Big Gorrilla. It's the $350 entry. It's a $1 million top prize that he drafted last weekend. And he mentioned he started after soaking in the first edition of Shawn's Big Gorrilla Bible, which is up on rotoviz.com. But also he mentioned that the update came in halfway through. So maybe we may have some thoughts from that, Shawn, that you may be able to see if there's anything that you would do different since that. He had the 101, he said, which was great, but he faced a challenge of what to do at the 2-3 turn, which I see is getting a little bit of coverage on RotoViz at the moment. He decided to take Jayden Daniels and pull him all the way up to the 301. He's usually going kind of mid to late third in this particular format, make him the QB1. We will talk about the draft board in a minute, but Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson both then went in the fourth round, so he was the first QB off the board. For the floor and ceiling, he figured Jamar Chase, George Kittle, and Daniels in their respective ceilings would be something that sets him up with a lot of flexibility on his way. So when we look through it, Shawn, I'll share the board in a moment and we'll work through as to what we may have done. The final roster ends up as Jayden Daniels and Bryce Young. And again, this is going to be a redraft format, so we'll be circling through that. You do need a kicker and a defense in this. So defense is San Francisco, kicker is Philadelphia Eagles, Jake Elliott. So the running backs are Scadaboo, Tootin, Spears, Hunter, Sampson, Giddens, and Mitchell, who, interestingly enough, Shawn mentioned at the end of the last show, is somebody to potentially have on your boards here for this season. Wide receiver, Jamar Chase. Then he has Tatora McMillan, DeVonta Smith, Jordan Addison, Jayden Reed, Luther Burden. Tight end then is George Kittle, Terrence Ferguson, and Jatavion Sanders. So, Shawn, this team, as we look at it, just in terms of the overall, like the players, the player profiles, before we actually dive into the roster construction, I think there's a lot. You can see that there's some of the Big Gorrilla Bible being reviewed here quite heavily to pick out some of these player profiles. They pretty much are all on brand here for an RV team.
Yeah, I'm not supposed to say this, Colm, because we want more people drafting, but I don't know. I don't know if I can draft any more in this contest. I don't think I can beat this team.
And I guess, Shawn, when we are talking about drafting in this contest, I'm sure some of our listeners, after they hear what we have to say today and having the updated Bible, can maybe put some tweaks on it, maybe a different roster spot or draft slot, and they'll be able to to challenge it. But how can listeners get $25 off when they draft in the Big Gorrilla?
Yeah, 25 RotoViz for new users, right? And obviously, we've got plenty of people listening who are already users. There are lots of other bonuses as well in the newsletter that Blair and Kevin are doing lots of great things with. So make sure you're getting over there, checking that out, getting those pieces and opportunities. But new users, 25 RotoViz. And so, Colm, to make it easy to remember, that can either be the year or it can be the amount that you get off, but 25, right? You can remember it either way. That's going to be the code for you. In order to save the $25, you do have to play an actual team. We get into this, and I mean, there are going to obviously be other pathways that work, but I kind of hate it when the users are so good with following the plan that they have like all my guys covered, because then I think about my future teams and I'm thinking, okay, well, Scattaboo, Tootin, Spears, Hunter, Sampson, Giddens, Mitchell.
Yes, please.
Well, you're certainly thinking that, and you're thinking that whatever combination you end up with individual drafts, this drafter here is going to have those covered. Now, is it covered with enough receiver firepower? But then you're thinking to yourself, okay, well, you have the elite QB, so that's the perfect starting lineup. You have the elite tight end, so that's the perfect starting lineup. You have Jamar Chase, who, Colm, I mean, one of the things you think back to just the previous season where CeeDee Lamb had a 400-point year, and he comes back, and obviously he's very good, but doesn't do anything like a 400-point year. Jamar Chase, when you think about all of the scenarios, is probably not really gapped in the way that it feels like he's gapped at this point. But I mean, he's gapped. And so when you have the 101, then you have this unique weapon that players out of other picks, for the most part, are not going to have exposure to. Now, you do have the occasional draft where someone takes someone else other than Jamar Chase, which, again, I think if you have someone else ranked number one, you should take them there, right? And this is a $350 contest. You don't want to look at it and say, oh, I got stuck with the 101, I have to take Chase. $350. Take your best guy, right? But you have this opportunity at Chase here, and then you do make those other 5 wide receiver selections in the first 8 rounds. And then the interesting thing that we have happening right now is that Luther Burden is super cheap. Now, does that reflect some risk? I mean, it certainly does. But you think about, especially in redraft, where you're less concerned about holes and you're more concerned about what is my starting lineup going to be in weeks 13 and 14 when I'm trying to win the league playoffs. Winning the league playoffs is very important in this format. And then what's my starting lineup going to be across weeks 15, 16, and 17? These issues that he's having right now, they are a potential problem in that the types of things that he's dealing with, where he's already hurt and he already seems lazy. I mean, those are the things that predispose a player to the kind of bust path. At the same time, I mean, a month from now, we could very easily be talking about how he's the best wide receiver in Chicago. DJ Moore was not good last year. His body language was bad. The reaction from the new staff was basically, if DJ Moore is not that much of a difference maker and his behavior is poor, then we're going to add a Luther Burden. Rome Odunze was disappointing last year. He's certainly not a pure bust. He's got a very wide range of outcomes for year 2. I mean, usually already by year 2, you've got a pretty good sense of the guy is a hit and he's going to be a star. Now, maybe he's going to be a star and there are some down seasons mixed in there, but he's basically going to be this high-level player. Or you have someone like where Quentin Johnston was last year, or Keon Coleman is this year, where it's like they still could hit, but it's now much more likely that they don't than that they do. Odunze is still in this range where he could end up being in the first round next year, or he could be Quentin Johnston next year. Luther Burden could be the wide receiver 1 on the Chicago Bears, a team where Cole Kmet was not very good last year, and Colston Loveland, it sounds to me like, is more injured and is more of an injury problem than Luther Burden. certainly listeners can kind of chime in on that. If they feel like he has absolutely no problems, then certainly Loveland at these prices is at least interesting, right? But you think about a team that has no running backs, has wide receivers coming off of frustrating years, has a weird dynamic at tight end, and Luther Burden has just been drafted by a team where they're like, everything else that we have, we've got all those guys in place, and we felt like Luther Burden was the guy we had to have. At the 12-12, you shouldn't be thinking too long about whether or not you're going to make that pick.
Yeah, I think
the pick could be worthless, but it's this 12-12.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff that you mentioned there was definitely priced in terms of the slide here. And we talked on the last show, you mentioned Le'Veon Bell and his injuries in the 2013 season that led to a lot of success on some of those teams that you had. You know, there is sometimes this storm that happens that like lowers, and then we're like a few weeks in. It's not going to be the same, but you mentioned Jamar Chase a moment ago. I remember, Jamar Chase and, OTAs couldn't catch the NFL ball because it didn't have the same stripes on it as the college ball. He just forgot how to catch the ball. If we had a narrator here for the podcast, like that was proven to be a lie. So Jamar Chase can in fact catch NFL footballs. Shawn, when we look though, a part I wanted to start on was the elite quarterback, and we didn't get to talking about it as a potential part of zero RB or trying to build that super team in 2025. But the interesting part on this, and it can be tough, I mentioned drafting at the turns, and you're looking at a team or a draft environment where QBs, if we look at how they're dotted across the board, are generally by ADP going in the kind of middle range of picks. So really you're either hoping a QB falls multiple extra picks to get to you, or you're having to take them ahead of ADP. So in this one here, trying to build out a team and make it a super team and, potentially have the QB1 at the end of the season, he takes Daniels ahead of ADP. The players that do go after that then are Chase Brown, T. Higgins, Kyron Williams, James Cook. Then it's the kind of wide receiver tier of Garrett Wilson, JSN, Marvin Harrison, DeVonta Adams, Terry McLaurin, Rashee Rice. And Tyreek Hill does go in this one at the 402, which, does seem are very particularly discussing this. I'm thinking this through before that trade even happens for Johnny Smith, but now that seems like a real true bargain. But Jayden Daniels
team selected both Christian McCaffrey and Tyreek Hill, and if they both bounce back, then every other
they
team
also have
Amon-Ra St. Brown catch up.
They also have Amon-Ra St. Brown and Rashee Rice, so they have started pretty nicely here. But when we look at the Jayden Daniels pick, and this kind of fits with that conversation that we have about like the ADP, the rankings, trying to fit it all together to build the roster. He takes George Kittle, which I think is a great pick at the back of the second round. But then you take the Daniels pick, and you're kind of like, if you're not in love with those names that I mentioned, you're like, well, it's a pretty flat area. And then it's like, do I like those over Daniels? What's the difference in the outcome? How do you feel about Daniels at the 301 and what the elite tight end in this particular format gives you to the rosters? It's something I know we've been talking a little bit more about this offseason, but is it becoming something that you're like, I want to do that, or are you staying kind of moving in the opposite direction? And is it, sorry, to add to that, is it basically Jayden Daniels or no other quarterback?
I think it certainly can be Lamar Jackson. Josh Allen's scoring track record and his individual game upside is such that it can obviously be him as well. I do think there are some projection related elements on Allen that it's one of these things where when guys have had what probably are ceiling seasons for a couple of years in a row, it feels more like the norm than the reality of it, which is that even with the way their offenses work, the number of rushing touchdowns that Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts are scoring are probably fluky to the high side. But it's a meaningful aspect of the profile where you create exposure to that on a full season basis, if they have the big full season run again, and then on the individual week basis, when you're talking about winning the $1 million. And when we're thinking about, how would I finish up high in the tournament, having that elite QB especially if you draft really well around them. One of the things that I've been looking at a little bit more recently is this idea that part of the reluctance to take an elite QB within, some type of, you don't even have to say 0RB, just with an elite build, is that you're giving away so much when you take them early, and your opportunity to either A, hit on the next Jayden Daniels, or B, put a combined team out there where maybe you have the next Justin Fields with the next Bo Nix, right? Something where you're able to put together, Baker Mayfield type of production. And you think about what you can do if you're drafting late. And if you get this mix of, say, like Jayden Daniels and Baker Mayfield from last year, you still have to, sort of manage that correctly and get the higher scores in more often than not. But that type of team is going to be even better than the elite QB team in many circumstances. But I think what that can sometimes miss is, firstly, just that it's difficult to hit on that combination of Daniels and Mayfield. But then also, if you are following the RotoViz principles, you're going to be out drafting the room in all of your drafts. In some of those drafts, you'll be out drafting them to the extent that simply having taken the elite QB was the thing that was kind of the final cherry on top, where it really distances you both from your group and puts you in that mix to win the million. So what it boils down to for me is like, part of the anti-elite QB notion is this notion of humility. And how can we maximize the number of really strong upside picks we're making, especially in these single-digit rounds? And then we're using, again, the wide range of outcomes, the talent, the chaos, all of those things to make sure we're also scoring well at QB. But it may actually be that the flip side of it is the thing you want to embrace, which is actually an arrogance as opposed to a humility when it comes to this particular pick. In that if you are out drafting the room overall, you probably want to take advantage of that by saying, okay, on top of that, I want an elite QB. Does that way of couching it sort of makes sense? And do you agree with that we're potentially going to, because in this case, and I think it's risky, but I do think that the upside for Chase Brown is still very meaningful, right? I've come around a bit on both Garrett Wilson and Jackson Smith and Jigba. And so this 2-3 turn for me is maybe not quite as weak as I felt it was 3 weeks or a month ago.
Yeah.
In that case, and you're then looking at round 11, you're looking at the 11-01, and it's Jarquez Hunter versus, you could take Kyler Murray there. And so you're thinking, okay, a Kyler Murray team with a Chase Brown or another elite wide receiver versus a Jayden Daniels team with a Jarquez Hunter. The fact of the matter is, the one that has Kyler Murray probably projects better, probably has a better floor. I mean, Jarquez Hunter is one of these really weird picks, right? Where it's most likely that he's not remotely worth the 11-01. But in the situations where he hits, then you go back to it and say, okay, well, now I prefer Jayden Daniels and Jarquez Hunter.
And the other thing to highlight on Hunter there and some of the other rookies, like, it is amazing to pull up an ADP draft or a draft board from a Gorilla contest here, an FFPC redraft format, and then pull up, the $125 draft for the Best Ball Tournament, or pulling up an Underdog draft, and to see the difference in, like, he's 11th round here. Like, there's a big difference in the ADPs and how the things shake out when you look at the two boards side by side. The thing though,
in the MFL 10 of Death, they forced me to take Jarquez Hunter in round 18.
Yeah, in round 18. So like there's just a massive variance. But the other thing is if the ADP is kind of skewed in that way, if you want to get him, you have to take him there. But the part that I would say when we look at the Jayden Daniels pick, and this is where it gets interesting. You mentioned Kyler Murray. You could have taken him there, but Jared Goff goes in the 15th round and JJ McCarthy goes one pick after that. You could have potentially done that at that point. When you look at the rest of the QBs that go, they kind of go before they get back to his selection, in the opposite direction. But if you're taking Jared Goff, then we'll talk about the tight ends in a moment, but you'd have to pass up Terrence Ferguson to get that pick. So there is also the balance of taking that elite quarterback and Jayden Daniels there allows you the flexibility later in the draft to get some of those other priority targets that you have. And it also means, and one of the things that he did here is he didn't take a second QB. There'll obviously be some quarterbacks on the waiver wire and that throughout it, but quite a few of the teams have taken a second quarterback. When you do wait, even some of the teams that have taken some of the elite options have also added that second quarterback, but it also gives him that additional roster spot to be able to have a Keaton Mitchell, for example, or to have a Jatavion Sanders to add to the roster. So I like the flexibility there. The part where this is where the pivot point for me is not necessarily at the running back, but when we look at the Jamar Chase, then Ted McMillan, DeVonta Smith, Jordan Addison, Jayden Reed, Luther Burden, all players that we're targeting in drafts this year. But you also have some question marks around, like if it's a case that the Eagles just stay true to form from what they were last year, like where are you comfortable on DeVonta Smith, week to week throughout the season, and especially in the early part of the season. Jordan Addison, again, we really like him. If that suspension comes into effect, you're a little bit behind there. Ted McMillan, we're hoping that he comes in and like hits the ground running as a rookie, but maybe it's a slow start. Maybe Bryce Young isn't as good as he has been to start the season. Jayden Reed, maybe the Packers don't go back to the pass as much as I want them to. Luther Burden, you talked through some of the potential red flags for him. I guess my pivot point there would be like, would you have a better roster if you had the rather than the Chase Brown, but if you had the Garrett Wilson, JSN, potentially even T. Higgins, even though it is a Jamar Chase team, would you be better in that situation to have them before some of the other names that are going there, and then maybe take your QB? And I know we talked about it being a situation where it's a kind of too much of an advantage at the 12-12 to like Luther Burden, but maybe that area is an area to look at the QB then and have that additional wide receiver. So I guess what I'm setting up here is, how do you feel about the overall wide receiver depth? So in this particular draft, there is 5 wide receivers through 8 rounds, that being Jamar Chase, McMillan, Smith, Addison, and Reed. And again, season long, we're very excited about all those players. How do you feel then with those, though, paired together on this particular roster? It could be like, because when we get into the running backs with the rookies mainly that are drafted here, you may also be in a situation where it's a slow start. So sometimes you could have like, well, we'll start just Jamar Chase, another wide receiver. We'll start George Kittle at tight end, and then we'll try and fill it with some of the running backs. But is there a case sometimes where we could leave a team where there's not enough of that immediate impact? You mentioned on the previous show about kind of the 12-week regular season. Is there a possibility sometimes with a team like this that we're looking and we're like week 4 and we haven't really got up to speed yet with the total projected outcome of the team for, when we're looking at week 8 or week 9 and what the team could be?
I think so. One of the things that we discussed a little bit on that Zero RB show, but it also sort of left out or didn't focus on a ton, is just that one of the reasons that Zero RB may not be a great fit for 2025 is that we do have questions about how much value, how much pop wide receivers are going to give us when they're being drafted like this. Is wide receiver the path to dominating the flex? And every roster is going to be a little bit different. And I think that my preference is to take the risk. But we want to be aware of what the risks are. And what you just outlined is a hugely important part of thinking through your approach to the 2025 season. Because what we're thinking about on a team that has Scadaboo and Tootin and Spears and Hunter and Sampson and Giddens and Mitchell is that team by midseason should be scoring a lot of running back points. That team by the final third of the season might have running backs in at least one, if not both, of the flexes. But it's simultaneously true that when you have that as your opening day roster at running back, the assumption in your mind is that my wide receiver position is going to dominate. And that when I've taken these 5 wide receivers early, that 4 of them fill into the 2 wide receiver and the 2 flex spots for week 1, and they're going to score. The tricky part in 2025 again is that like maybe they won't, right? And you have to take on a little bit of that risk to get the talent that you want. You have to take on a little bit of that risk with McMillan. But you have to be aware that if it's McMillan and then also a 0 RB and also a lot of young running backs, that you are looking at a week 1 where your projected total, I mean, this team probably projects to lose in week 1. And that's not ideal, right? There just are a limited number of weeks. You hate to be 0-1 and immediately chasing. We don't know when that Addison suspension will come, and we don't know what the Packers are going to look like in week 1. And so, that potential hurdle or that potential problem that you mentioned, I mean, it could be very real when Brad is looking at week 1 and starting, figuring out his starting lineup. It's like, I'm looking at this now and I am uncomfortable with the fact that I project to lose in the first week.
Yeah, and I would be starting, like if I'm looking at this and I think who will start, I think it's going to be Tyjae Spears and Scadaboo is probably who you're starting. But it's also hard to, to see the split between Spears and Pollard and Scadaboo and Tracy in week 1 is going to be a little bit challenging. But then, because what I was kind of trying to lead that question in was the wide receiver depth. You embedded Stealing Bananas last week, which was a lot of great information, and as always, but kind of Shawn sent over a title, and then I changed it for the YouTube video where I said wide receiver depth is a fantasy football myth. And, I think looking at the opening 3 rounds of wide receiver, it is quite interesting to see, like you mentioned, there's a couple of names that are coming more into the 4 if you're thinking for wanting to draft them in the 3rd round. But it is that case once you're in that 4th round, as much as we like some of these names and moving on down through, there is some questions around them. But my question then would be, this roster for week 1 is probably set up much better if it's Kenneth Walker at that 4-5 turn versus either McMillan or DeVonta Smith. And then that also gives you an upside running back. And again, coming back to what we talked about what the draft boards are giving you at running back in 2025, gives you a starting running back with the upside to potentially be somebody who could be drafted in the 2nd round next season, and is giving you that additional piece of could be, starter worthy, or certainly starter worthy in week 1, but also has the upside to be a key piece all season long. And then maybe getting an additional wide receiver in that Tootin, Spears, Hunter potential kind of range. And there's not as much going in the Hunter range, but that Tootin pick, you may be able to go in a slightly different direction. Would you rather this team, when we're talking about like the hero RB, 0 RB thing, if it had Kenneth Walker there at the 4-5 turn?
Yeah, I think that's a way to do it. I mean, one of the things that you want to do anytime that you draft is you go back and think, okay, well, what if I took these different paths? And would I like those teams better or worse? And will those teams have like even more extreme upside or not? And so if you look at this particular team and you say, okay, I'm going to take Jackson Smith and Jigba or Garrett Wilson at the 301. And then at the 4-5 turn, I'm going to take Kenneth Walker and my preference between RJ Harvey and Travion Henderson. And then at the 701, I'm going to take Patrick Mahomes. Like, do I like that team better or worse? Now, and in part because the Patrick Mahomes is an interesting one. I keep teasing this Chiefs article. If it's not out by the time this pod releases, there's going to be a flurry kind of this week and around Independence Day and that kind of thing wrapping in the next week.
And this show, much more difficult right around that, so it's probably a good time to say, Happy 4th of July to all the listeners.
Yeah, Happy 4th of July. It's such a great time for family and country and all of those things. Colm, Patrick Mahomes has massive, massive upside. And it's much harder for that pass-oriented QB to hit it than it will be for someone like Jayden Daniels. But when we're thinking through, how do you get the most? So, Colm, for me, the DeVonta Smith pick is really hard. And when I say the pick, I mean, DeVonta Smith's evaluation for me is really hard because you go and you look at him and, he's just so good. His ability to score when they don't pass and he's playing with A.J. Brown, it's pretty insane. I don't feel like you can pass on a player as good as DeVonta Smith at the 501. I simultaneously looking forward to week 8 or to week 14 or to the final week, and you're putting that starting line together on the last Sunday, and you're thinking, like, who's more likely to go off for 30? Is it DeVonta Smith? Is it Kenneth Walker? Is it R.J. Harvey? Is it Travion Henderson? I've kind of tilted it in the direction of it's, probably the running backs. We don't know, right? But these are questions you want to ask yourself in terms of, like, who do you like? And one of the things I feel very comfortable with and want readers to feel comfortable with is that the Big Gorrilla tiers and rankings in the articles and then on the site are put together with a lot of thought that includes these types of questions and is trying to help set people up to draft juggernaut teams. At the same time, I'm certainly hoping that all of the individual users are also asking these questions for themselves and drafting the specific team when it's their team and they're on the clock that hits on their version of what they think will happen. In some ways, even kind of what you want to happen. You want to be sitting there on Sundays and really, comfortable rooting for your team, that it's the most fun, exciting team as well. And you should feel comfortable drafting those running backs if you think that they're a better fit. And Colm, they're just objectively ranked higher for me as well, which isn't to say that you have to pick them structurally. I just do want to mention that they are actually just also higher. And so I'm saying I think they will score more. Now, how that fits into the overall build, but one of the things, Colm, that we talked about last time is that people are just not using the double-digit rounds effectively. They are not drafting the guys in the double-digit rounds who have the most ability to improve their overall value. And this team here, again, with Scatterboo, Tootin, Spear, Hunter, Sampson, Giddens, Mitchell, those guys are so good. And I would be absolutely shocked if you don't get breakout running backs from that group. Yeah. And then that changes the conversation, which is exactly the reason that zero RB exists.
Yeah, and that's what makes it very challenging, is I'm kind of saying Kenneth Walker will be good for this team, but then you're like, well, we have all these guys that are going to be good as the season goes. And that's just that balance, the counterbalance of, trying to get all the pieces in. So I think this is one way to build out this team, but I think there is some areas where you could potentially have, you mentioned at the start, drafting a team, how are we going to beat this? Well, I think there's going to be situations if you're drafting from maybe the 4 that you get some of these extra values in terms of, when I'm saying value, a priority target that maybe makes it a couple of additional picks. So maybe you're not having to draft Jayden Daniels. At that point, you get an additional option. That's just the kind of overall part of like putting it together. And you may, like in this particular draft, with the pick of Jordan Addison, Jerry Jeudy went 3 picks before. Maybe having him there takes away the suspension risk. And I know people will have like more red flags with Jerry Jeudy than we do, Shawn, but there's other ways that it could work out kind of favorable for you to make the lineup, come out a little bit smoother. The other players, I guess.
I did want to note with that is that I'm tending to draft late QB with the early picks because I'm I'm already uncomfortable with the elite QBs where they're priced.
Yeah. I think that would be my thought too.
And so, one of the things I did want to mention is that one reason you would go with elite QB is that I think the best way to put together a team that is like straightforwardly in the mix, just simply at QB, not overall, but at QB with the elite QBs, is that you go QB at say like the 10-11. But if you do that, you're not just losing one spot, you're losing two. And that is, again, very meaningful when you're talking about if I feel like I can generally, over time, I'm going to outdraft my opponents. Why would I give up 2 picks? Right, 2 picks is a lot. So then the next thing is, well, how would you do it less expensively? I mean, Bryce Young was the 2012.
Yeah.
I mean, Bryce Young is basically my pick to be this year's Baker Mayfield. And so, I mean, you could draft this team and only take Bryce Young at the 2012. You could save QB for your very last pick. Now, I've tended to do it where I have like Bryce Young and Cam Ward, who doesn't get drafted at all in this draft, right? You put those 2 guys together, I mean, you have a lot of upside. But also the other thing I did want to mention is that when you raise Jayden Daniels this much, then you have him with Jamar Chase in a situation where virtually no one else will. So that's the other huge benefit of it, right? Is that when you are out there and you're competing with the Jayden Daniels teams in week 17, I mean, you're the person who can say, you know who else I have? Jamar Chase. Or if you're competing with all Jamar Chase teams in week 17 to win the $1 million, you're like, you know who else I have? Jayden Daniels. Yep. So I mean, we don't know that is going to transpire in that way, but that's certainly, I think, a perfectly fine justification for this pick here.
Yep. No, that's a very good point in the uniqueness of the roster, particularly when you get to that sprint point of the contest. The other players, Shawn, we didn't mention, so we George Kittle in the second, then we get Terrence Ferguson, Javonte Sanders in the 15th and 17th. They are players that we've talked quite a bit about. We talked a lot about Ferguson and the draft kind of rotation. Jatavion Sanders, somebody who was drafted last year, was moving in the right direction, got the injury, and then kind of faded out for the end of the season. Those 2 guys paired with George Kittle in a tight end premium format, I think, is very intriguing. The other thing with this is they're going to be players. I do think with Ferguson in particular, it's going to be hard if you're 5 weeks into the season and we're not seeing a lot from him to cut him from the roster. It's going to be he's kind of one of those ones you're going to be, I think, holding on to in some weeks where, if he doesn't hit early. But both of those, I think, pair very well with a George Kittle. I'm very optimistic about the tight end room. Any thoughts to add on the tight end room other than tight end room good? Yeah, I mean, it's really well set up. We talked in the previous show about getting that elite tight end. It just makes your roster very different. In pursuit of making sure we're thinking through the different possibilities, instead of taking out Jayden Daniels, if you do take out George Kittle there and make that the additional receiver pick or the Chase Brown pick, what have you, then you have this possibility at the Scadaboo pick of taking Evan Ingram. You have the possibility at the Tootin pick of taking Tucker Kraft. Both of those picks are pretty intriguing. Now, we might get a little bit of a Jonnu Smith reaction where both of those guys get a little bit more expensive because Jonnu is kind of holding that tier in a certain price because it gives you an additional possibility. And once you lose that additional possibility, then all the guys have to rise because now we have just a little bit more scarcity. But I think Ingram and Tucker, or Ingram and Kraft, to refer to him by his last name there, we have possibilities for them to replicate some of what Kittle does. And, in a 90th percentile outcome, maybe the whole thing. And then again, if you hit on that contingent play, then maybe you would simply prefer that. We know that George Kittle has not always been healthy. We know that you have some risk of either routes or just, if both Pearsall and Jennings play well in the first half of the season, and then they bring Ayuk back and he immediately jumps in and plays well. Now you're starting to look at a situation where if Christian McCaffrey is healthy, then the target volume for Kittle isn't really there.
And so you look at him at the 212 and you're like, man, I hope he scores touchdowns because we're suddenly kind of touchdown dependent on him. We also want to think about like, where is this opportunity to beat the way people are looking at this season? Last year, one of the things that we were telling people is that, I mean, George Kittle and Mark Andrews are the same play, and Kittle is the better player. Why is Kittle so much less expensive? We could be wrong on that take, but simply the fact that the price is also so different. You don't have to be that right about it. You don't have to be as right as we were. You just have to kind of not be completely wrong, and you're going to more or less be okay. I don't know that it's the exact same thing this year with Kittle and Andrews, because Andrews was just even so much worse. But there is still this little bit of an element where, like, if it's a touchdown play, then Mark Andrews is a lot cheaper, right? So, I mean, that's an exaggeration, or it's focusing on one type of scenario. But we want to make sure we're thinking about those things. We want to think about, you know, what Ingram could do now unleashed by Peyton, even though the numbers last season would suggest that he probably doesn't have that like elite run after the catch upside to be a massive star with the Broncos. I think Kraft does, but Colm, I mean, your Packers didn't want to throw the ball at all last year.
They're going to throw it more this year. I'm convinced. But yeah,
so
I think
when you have Scatterboo, Tootin, Spears, Hunter, Sampson, Giddens, Mitchell, it is also a little bit of a reminder that that's a lot of guys. Those guys are all good. If you had to take one of them out and put in either a QB or a tight end, you would still have a lot of talent there.
Yeah.
Not saying you should, but those are some of the things you'd be thinking about as you're drafting this team.
Yeah, and it's very hard to be like, that's the one I would take out, but there's 7 running backs based on your 20 roster spot allocation, and then you have a kicker and a defense in there as well with 2 quarterbacks, 3 tight ends. So there is a possibility to take one down. It's hard when you're looking through the other picks available at those particular picks. Again, if you are looking at this draft board and the way it goes back and forth, obviously at the turns, there's some players that I'd be interested in that are just going like 1 or 2 picks ahead of where the selection would have been made. But I think this was fun because it's a team that we really like, players we really like, and then it's just kind of having that kind of contrarian or devil's advocate conversation around how we maybe should be looking through those possible scenarios. So love the team that was submitted there by Brad. Good conversation. Hopefully people enjoyed it, and good luck with this team in the Big Gorrilla. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on social media at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of his work on rotoviz.com. If you're signing up over at RotoViz, you can use the code RVRadio2025 at checkout to get yourself a 10% discount. We did mention a moment ago, but happy 4th of July to all those that do celebrate it. And until we are back, have a good one.